This is Biology 2, Chapter 3 on communities, biomes, and ecosystems. In Part 1 of this video lecture, we will be discussing community ecology as well as types of ecological succession. Now, we've defined what a biological community is in our last chapter. Remember, the biological community is all of the different biotic factors, the living factors, as well as the different populations that are interacting together. So abiotic and biotic factors play a very important role in the biological community, and it can affect it in either a negative way or a positive way. Organisms will adapt to the conditions in which they live for survival in their biological community. So depending on which factors are present and in what quantities, organisms can survive in some ecosystems, but not in others. So take, for example, here are two pictures. We have a cactus in the Mojave Desert. We could not take a cactus and put it into the tropical rainforest of the Amazon, mainly for two reasons. One, cactus has adapted to live a lifestyle of having very long periods of time with no precipitation. They have adapted their bodies to store water in times of dryness, and if you put a cactus in the rainforest, it would drown and die. Because even though one would think that a cactus would like to be in an environment with plenty of water, it actually could not survive in an environment with lots of precipitation because it's been adapted to live in an area with low amounts of precipitation. Also, the temperatures would have an effect. The cactus would essentially rot in the Amazon rainforest because the temperature never does get low enough. Despite most people thinking deserts being very hot all the time, it actually gets very cold at night. And again, the cactus has adapted to live in that sort of environment with kind of an extreme range for temperatures. Populations or communities cannot get infinitely huge. There are factors that will restrict how many members are in the population or how many groups of animals are in the community. Those are called limiting factors. A limiting factor is any factor, it could be biotic or abiotic, that restricts the numbers, reproduction, or the distribution of organisms. And basically, the availability of resources is key. And those big four resources that we'll need to know, the big four are food, space, shelter, and mates. We've talked about homeostasis in Biology 1. Remember, homeostasis is an organism's way of controlling its and maintaining its internal environment. For the external environment, all organisms have basically what we call a range of tolerance. Every environmental factor has an upper and a lower limit that define conditions for survival. And obviously in the optimum tolerance range, that's where homeostasis could be maintained. Once you get into the stress zone, there may not be as many organisms in the population or the community that survive. And if you get too far towards the zone of intolerance, then you won't have any members of survival. And that can be on a lower limit or an upper limit of tolerance. The two main factors that decide where organisms live the way they do are temperature and precipitation, because the temperature and precipitation are closely intertwined. Organisms live where they live because they have a range of tolerance for those temperatures and for those levels of precipitation. Ecosystems change. They're changing constantly. They can change either slightly or drastically, depending on what's going on in the environment. but the change is occurring mostly because of abiotic factors. So we'll consider this types of natural change for abiotic factors. So ecological succession is the change in an ecosystem that happens when one community replaces another. There's two types of succession. Primary ecological succession is kind of like an ecosystem that has to start from scratch. There's an establishment of a community in the area of exposed rock or no soil. So primary succession literally starts from bare rock and has to build upon there. Some examples: after a lava flow or after a glacier. So this is a bare environment. There's no soil, there's no plants, there's no nothing. So primary succession happens very slowly at first. So the soil actually needs to develop from the weathering and erosional processes of the rock before plants can grow, because very few plant species can grow without soil. Once the soil develops, after many years of the rock breaking down from weathering and erosion, the very first species to come around we call the pioneer species. So they're the first organisms to colonize an area undergoing primary succession. So just like the pioneers arrived in the Old West, they were the first Americans to kind of set seed there. The pioneer species are the same thing. Many pioneer organisms are usually very small. They're things like pollen or spores or even lichens, which is an association of algae that live on rocks. They actually take the nutrients out of the rocks itself. So they help create soil for small weedy plants or fungus to grow. A lot of pioneer species grow very quickly. They set seed very quickly, and they are usually annual types of grasses or plants that appear every year. Eventually, given enough time, seeds from taller trees or plants are blown in by the wind or transported by animals, either on their fur or through dropping of their feces as they're walking along in the forest. The climax community is kind of the, if we were to call it an end point, this would be the end point of succession. However, succession does continue on and can continue on. So the climax community is the stable, mature community that will change very little. Most climax communities are either tall evergreen trees or different species of deciduous trees. So they are very shade tolerant, whereas pioneer species are very shade intolerant. The diagram here on the bottom shows you kind of from start to finish of primary succession. So we start with bare rock. Over time, it starts to break down. It weathers. Lichens, pollens, spores, the like, end up in the area. That further breaks down the rock, gets a small layer of soil for small annual plants. Eventually, we have more breakdown. Perennial herbs and grasses show up. We then eventually, in the intermediate stages, have some taller grasses and shrubs, and again, shade intolerant trees, so they need lots of sunlight. And then the climax community then is developed with the shade tolerant trees. Now, secondary succession is almost like a do-over for an ecosystem. Secondary succession is the establishment of a community in an area where there was a previous existing community. Some good examples of this, an abandoned park. If city parks are not maintained, eventually you notice, the weeds grow over, the grasses get taller, you get some interesting shrubs kind of placed randomly here and there. Also after a flood is another good example. Floods can wash away a lot of soil as well. So secondary succession is kind of like a do-over because the soil is already present, so we don't have to start from bare rock. Again, succession can continue, so the endpoint can't easily be predicted in an area because ecosystems are constantly changing. And of course, human activities are involved in that, as well as natural processes that can affect the type of succession and the rate that it happens. So this has been part 1 of chapter 3 on communities, ecosystems, and biomes.